Good morning, everybody. I hope we've had a great opening session here at the GIJC. Like you've heard, my name is John Alanamu. I am an investigative journalist working for Africa Uncensored, based in Kenya. And we are talking about what is perhaps one, or was, one of the central, parts or focuses of any functioning democracy, or at least that's what they tell us, which is elections. And I feel fairly certain that most of you in this room have had some experience with an election, either as a voter, as an observer, or as a journalist who's been reporting it. And I have the distinct honor of moderating this discussion this morning leading into the afternoon, and you'll be part of it as well. There'll be a section of this panel that we're going to leave to you to ask all of the questions that you want to ask to our very esteemed panel. And I'd like to start first by introducing a very distinguished researcher. She is a senior research fellow at the Tau Center at the Columbia School of Journalism. Pri Bengani, please make your way up to the stage. And in African tradition, we're not shy with clapping, so please let's try and be a little generous with our applause. All right, next up on stage, she has done some really incredible work. If you remember the name Cambridge Analytica, then you probably will have read some of her work. Now, it's been quite a number of years since that very dark horse in the 2016 to 2018 election cycle was part of it, but since then there have been iterations, as we heard also in the opening panel. Carol Cadwaladr from The Guardian, investigative journalist, author, writer, features editor. Welcome to the stage, Carol. And finally, part of the brave group of journalists who are, part of the cohort that really did some incredible work around the presidency of Mr. Bolsonaro down in Brazil, leading obviously to numerous exposés around the kind of person that he is, the money laundering that he was involved in, and of course, some of the more divisive elements of his presidency, things that we, I'm sure, can recognize in some of our leaders, depending on which country you're from. Juliana Dalpiva from UOL in Brazil, columnist and investigative journalist, and a podcaster. All right, thank you very much. Let us get this started. All right, so I want to start in the center with you, Carol. Yeah, and perhaps one of the first and most widely known elections or campaigns where the nexus of technology and bad actors was with the Brexit campaign. Obviously, there were elements in the 2016 Trump campaign. My own country had experiences of it, excuse me, which was around Cambridge Analytica. Tell us what it was like, sort of peeking behind the curtains to figure out that this organization, this set of bad actors, was behind a very, very intense misinformation and disinformation campaign. Then we can move forward.
Thanks, John. Pleasure to be here, and how nice to be on a panel with a token man.
I accept that. I accept it.
I think the thing, so 2016, I guess, when the Brexit referendum happened, I was a feature writer. I wasn't paying any attention to it really, apart from it as a general participant. And it was only after the Trump got elected in 2000, and this term, we first started hearing about fake news, that I then sort of got interested in the subject. And really the sort of shock to me and surprise was that I was like, well, they started talking about fake news on Facebook. And so obviously the question was, well, what did that look like? Let's have a look at it. And, and there's this company which I found out, had worked in the Trump campaign. This is when the name Cambridge Analytica was first, an academic first sort of used that name with me. And he said, and they worked for the Leave campaign in Britain too. So obviously I just wanted to know what they did. What were these adverts? What did this fake news look like on Facebook? And then what I discovered was that there was absolutely no way of looking at it. And there was no archive, there was no library, there was no repository, there was no way to get that information out of Facebook. It turned out that at the time, journalists hadn't been looking at it because they didn't see it. It wasn't directed at them apart from anything else. So I was just kind of gobsmacked as I entered into this world of understanding that, oh, hold on a minute. And the director of the Leave campaign in Britain, who subsequently has gone on to be very famous, is this political sorry, I've lost my words there. Political, I was just trying to think of what the right, Dominic Cummings he's called. Anyway, he's become a very famous person in Britain. But he was very open about the fact that they spent all of their money, pretty much 90% of it, online, on digital campaigning, on Facebook ads, that they'd bought more than 1 billion of them. And so they would been open about that, but yet it had been completely invisible. And so trying to sort of crack open that black box and find out what happened was a long and painstaking process that we never actually got to the bottom of, because ultimately, ultimately it got to the stage where our parliaments and 11 other parliaments around the world joined forces and sort of demanded answers from Mark Zuckerberg and demanded that we should actually have access to that data. And we've never actually got it. So what happened in 2016 is still locked inside that black box. But since then, there has been, certain transparency measures. Actually, in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Facebook brought in the ad library, and clever people like Pri and many others have, really come up with creative ways of sort of trying to understand what's going on. Yeah. And so that thing about monitoring elections in real time is the vital thing that we've learned, monitoring what is going on online. That's what didn't happen in 2016. But I think, the thing really, I suppose, to put this into context and why, it's brilliant that so many people are interested in this subject is because I do think, we are entering into unknown territory. What is coming down the line in the next 18 months, we've got this sort of situation where half of the world is going to the polls. There's elections across a huge number of countries, many of which are already fragile democracies. At the same time, we've got these incredibly powerful new tools, generative AI being unleashed. And while a lot of the debate around that is around the super intelligent robots which are going to take our jobs and take over the world, really, I think probably a lot of here is that actually one of the first casualties is going to be the truth and evidence-based reporting, because the ability to create massive disinformation at scale, at no cost, is, that reality is here. And I think the thing that I feel at the moment is that we don't even really have the imagination quite yet to understand the ways that very motivated bad actors will be able to use that in a highly personalized way. And the thing that we do know about elections and technology is that elections accelerate technological disruption, because they are a singular event. It's a zero-sum game. You have motivated actors, you have a lot of money, and you have the ability to just try different things and see what sticks. So my sort of big picture view is that, we didn't know what was happening in 2016. It took this extraordinary effort through journalists and civil society and the FBI and all sorts of other people. And we've created, there's been this, real effort to kind of come together to try and monitor them. But I think we are now again going into a really unknown space.
Unknown territory. And you said something about the singularity of elections in terms of being able to funnel all that attention, all that technology towards one event where there's almost like a winner-take-all outcome, right? But things happen on a daily basis, and there's been advancements towards that, those kinds of events. And you're helping the world understand what those things are from a technological point of view. Since we first heard the term fake news, and we've been treated to the spectacles of Trump or Bolsonaro or many of the various leaders who've been able to use these kinds of tools, what kind of things are you seeing on a day-to-day basis that you think are going to be important to sort of make a note of? There's generative AI, as well, but on a day-to-day basis, what kind of tools do you think are going to be used and supercharged to sort of use for the focus of an election?
Right, this thing is just on, I think. We'll find out. Yeah, so I think one of the things that's interesting is that we've got this concept of fake news, which is now basically used to describe anything anybody doesn't like on the internet. But I also think that what's more effective is things that have a kernel of truth and then can then be distorted into something else. And I think at that point we kind of come into more influence operations, but also like this idea of creating either a surround sound ecosystem or an echo chamber where you have like multiple parties working in conjunction coordination to push the same narrative. And if you're seeing the same thing on TV as you're seeing on Facebook, as you're then listening to on the radio, then, like, even if it's not entirely accurate, if you keep seeing the same thing again or hearing the same thing again and again, that becomes your basis for what's real. And I think then that does more damage because that's what's kind of like distorting your perception of reality.
So there's a steady drumbeat of fake news, well, not to use fake news, but propaganda that happens again and again and again. Just speak to some of the, before we move on to Juliana, just speak to the structure and the formatting of these kinds of echo chambers, how they formed. Is it real people behind desktops, or is it something that's more automated with singular messages that are just, pumped through?
I think it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. So what I mean by that is, and there's a lot of grifting, right? Because I think like a lot of grifters, especially after 2016, realized that they could just capitalize on, well, grifting. And so yeah, I think it's effectively, there is a machinery behind this who work in conjunction, and then they get help from outside actors, be it foreign actors, be it local actors, and then there are folks who are embracing conspiracies because they could make some money out of it and they know it gets the clicks. And I think what I was mentioning to Carol just prior to this conversation was there's this entire thing around moral outrage contagion where it's like if you use more outraged words, then it goes more viral online. So, like let's just build upon that.
Yeah. And a person who used outrageous statements every day, reaching around from Brazil all the way to Nairobi, is your former president, Bolsonaro. And when he came onto the scene, there wasn't much around the world that was known about him, right? And eventually he becomes this person who's a focal point for lots of disinformation. You've investigated him, soup to nuts, to use that expression. And what do you think about him was, I guess, so not important, but what do you think about his personality and his background was important for journalists to have known, to sort of look into the future and read the tea leaves a little bit and figure that this would be a person that would then become a bad actor, that would then now use the kinds of networks that Priya's talked about and eventually build this kind of disinformation campaign around himself?
First, John, I would like to share a thing about what they were saying. We just published with a clip that is Center for Latin American Investigations, a special report on how this is a market now. There are communications consultants selling apps and all kinds of services about this all over Latin America. And we did found some things on Spain also. And inside of all of our countries, they are selling this as a service. There's lots of money. We don't know because there are no transparency between the platforms. And they are engaging people in lies and hate. And now this project is called Digital Mercenaries. And we actually did this between 22, if I'm not wrong now, different media outlets on all over Latin America. And Bolsonaro is a lie. Everything he says about himself is there are no better word to describe him, because he has a speech saying that he's a conservative, religious, not corrupt, outside of system. And I actually knew him like 10 years ago when I was investigating the military from the dictatorship. And I knew him, I knew people around him. And 10 years, almost 10 years later, like 2018, when he was running for the presidency for the first time, what I discovered between me and my colleagues was that he was in 30 years in our public life in Brazil on Congress, but we never investigated him because we do have 513 congressmen. So he was never a player on the big game.
Yeah.
He was no important. And because of many different things inside of our politics, he raised it at that moment. And even between all of this campaign of disinformation and using all the worst we have in these platforms to engage people in hate and lies, and selling this fraud speech. And that came through a victory in the end of 2018. But I started to do, during that election, one investigation trying to respond who he really is. And I started I created some sort of a system investigating everything about every aspect of his life, his family, his biography, his assets, how he made through 2018. And some things weren't clear at that point about how, because he had no money before he was on politics. And then he put like everybody about on his family, his 3 oldest sons, 2 former wives, and then many other people, 22 on total, inside of his offices. And that created a money laundering scheme, because he used it to demand like 90% of the salaries of people who worked for him. And that made houses, lands, and for everybody on his family. And he built his money and his political career and his son's political careers.
So a politician or a political actor who has bad intentions, who works outside of the law and flies beneath the radar, only for him to use this kind of influence and money to be able to pop up and win an election. How many of us have heard of politicians like that? I suspect we might have heard of 1 or 2 of them, right? So you built a system around which to investigate Bolsonaro, which then would aid you across the many years, not many years, but the few years of his presidency. But I want to go back and ask a question I think a lot of us journalists wonder about, right? So we think that the logic sort of dictates that we throw facts at any person who uses these kinds of emotionally triggering language and moral outrage, thinking that that's going to be the thing that helps people see these politicians, these actors, with a more clear-eyed lens. But did that work with respect to Bolsonaro, and does that work?
What I thought that was powerful was publishing my stories with documents, with recordings, with video, every chance that I get. I avoided all the background sources, off-the-record sources. I use it to get off-the-record information, tips from many different people, and try to find ways to prove that, to have something to prove. And that was something that in the beginning, I thought that I received less hate from the social media. And then with time, I actually started to receive some messages from people saying that, no, I voted for him, but now I'm seeing what is happening, and I do believe we made a huge mistake. I got a few messages like this, saying that, "No, I'm not going to vote for him anymore because I know now he's a lie." But I don't know how much that impact was. He actually lost the election, and we did wrote a very important story about this, and during it was like a year ago, it was September of last year. And it was important because he was building again a campaign saying he was no corrupt. And we did show it that his son, his family had bought like 51 properties on cash. And he actually had to face this during the hardest part of the campaign, like 2 or 3 weeks before the first term, the first round of the election. And that sort of made a point against his speech. And when he had no way to respond this, he went to court to find a ruling to censor us. And we did actually had to come to Supreme Court to get rid of the censorship to our story.
Yeah, and this question goes to the three of you, because in that initial moment when you were reporting, and I suspect the same as well of you, Carol, there was, very robust, to put it mildly, feedback from the audience, pushback from perhaps some of the people who are more vested in, say, the Brexit campaign or the Bolsonaro campaign. Carol, I want to ask this to you first, and then everyone can chime in with their experiences. Sitting from my point of view, and we spoke about this off stage, I wouldn't have much to worry about as a man reporting on anything that might have logically happened. But as women, this is different, right? So how did it, or what was the impact as a woman reporting on such incredibly important moments in your electoral path, in your history in the United Kingdom? What was the impact to you?
Well, that's kind of multi-part, actually, because my investigation went on for so long, and it had so many different sort of stages, and ultimately ended up with me having this very long-running legal case being brought against me. But actually, we were just talking, just to link it with other matters and with what you were saying, in that actually when I first started reporting on this in 2017, and was sort of digging into this landscape and writing about Cambridge Analytica, throughout, before actually we did this sort of big investigation of bringing out this whistleblower, it was some of the biggest pushback I got was from the tech bros. So it was from the reporters who were on the technology beat in Silicon Valley, and they were the ones saying, well, this is just snake oil, there's nothing new here, they all do it. And what was really interesting, and I think does sort of like is something to consider in this, is that there are different ways of looking at the same problem. And so the tech reporters were looking at it from the view of Silicon Valley companies, and not looking at it from the point of view of what I was in Britain, which was that I kept on asking, is it legal? Like, that was like, I didn't ask, does it work, how effective it is, what exactly. I was just like, is what was being done here legal? And that was a question that they didn't address. And that was, I think, that coming in as a middle-aged woman in another country, not from that technology beat, just gave me a different sort of angle and perspective on it, and also a geographical perspective because of being outside Silicon Valley. And I think the second thing as well I would say on that, which relates to what you were saying, is that although like we now have these tools, there are ways of looking to see what's going on in real time, being able to put the facts out there, like you say, that doesn't necessarily work. So before we came out with the New York Times and did this big sort of splash, many of the facts of what the company had done were in the public domain by that point. But it was the fact of having this person who could talk to it in this very articulate way, supported by documents, That was the sort of breakthrough in terms of storytelling it to the public. It was a really complex, dry story about data and elections and politics, which didn't, capture people's imagination, but actually having the real life human subject. And this goes to something, I'll pass it over to, which what Pri was saying to me, is that actually old school, although there's these whizzy new data tools, actually old school journalism in this is sort of, and really thinking about the storytelling of it is a sort of key aspect too.
Yeah, I think the thing around big tech companies pushing back is, it's like they don't want, like, I kind of feel like, and we were just saying this, that everything they do is usually a PR exercise. So, they're going to do the bare minimum they can to avoid too much bad press. And I think the other thing is, like, with respect to my work, I haven't received a ton of harassment or anything, like nothing compared to what either Juliana or Carol have. But every now and again, I've got like a legal note, and it's like, yeah, your facts are all wrong. And I'm like, well, here's the evidence. Can you please explain where I'm wrong? And then it's cricket. And it's like, well, what was the point of involving your lawyers in that case? I don't completely understand. But, and then you press the big green button, you go to press, and then nothing happens. And it's just like, well, that was an exercise in pointlessness. So, but yeah, I mean, I don't, yeah.
Okay. How about you, Juliana?
It's not comfortable to say that it is a thing that we have to assume that it's different for us as women journalists, for all people from the LGBTQ community also, and for Black people also. I think we as women, we were most of Bolsonaro's target during this period, because there are many women in journalism. We are more as a number on the newsrooms as reporters. And at this, during his term, me and other colleagues broke very different important stories about him. And we lead this process on investigating him. And this is a very usual way for machists to do it, to just came after us, thinking we're fragile, thinking we are going to just avoid the subject after because of these. So I remember that in the first year, two closest friends were really attacked, sexual harassment, doxing campaigns. One of them was faced some sort of experience like Projeto Veritas. And that, of course, came to me also because I was doing my work, and I actually invited male colleagues to work with me and sign my first pieces, to don't be a target, also to keep doing the job. But at some point, things got more and more complicated and sensitive with sources that only wanted to meet with me, and I started to be attacked on social media. And because there was always the same name. Once I was signing with one and then with another, but Juliana was also always reporting. And at some point, I thought that I should be also on social media as a constant presence, and started to create a way to talk to people about my stories on Twitter, on Instagram, showing the most important parts, showing the videos, showing the documents, and making people understand the headlines a little bit more, and trying to find more closest ways to get to the audience. And that worked a little. And even when they started these defamation campaigns, I think in some sort of way it was better to be there with some presence than to not be at all.
Yeah. I want to move to something that's also been a focal point for some of these individuals, but is really a very important part of any election, which is the backbone of any election, which is the infrastructure that actually counts, the institutions that are charged with managing the elections. In the United States, obviously with the outcome of the Fox and Dominion ruling, we saw that that was a targeted campaign by, what was, for better or for worse, one of the largest media companies in the United States. But the question I want to ask is about the amount of focus that journalists need to, to pay attention to when looking at the infrastructure that is charged with carrying out an election successfully. Oftentimes, because the personalities are so big and because the issues are so emotive, these rather basic-looking, underpinnings of an election sort of get passed over. So, first, you, Juliana, how much time do you need to spend on checking whether the I's have been dotted, the T's have been crossed with the electoral agency in Brazil? And is there anything that you found there that perhaps would be ground for other journalists who are in the audience to start thinking about, maybe I need to start focusing on this now?
I think we do have to monitor social media, and this is forever, and this is not going to be enough. But we do have to do that. But ground reporting is still really, really, really important. And usually, at least in Brazil, editors use it to call us like 2 or 3 months before the election. Well, let's organize. How are we going to cover? And of course, this is not enough and not even the best way to do it. I think the best way in the ideal world is like a year before. You have to start looking into the biggest, at least 3 names, 2 or 3 names that are starting this campaign, running some events. You have to go to these events to see who is with the candidate daily and who's not. And after that, you start to build your map of sources. People who you're going to call when you need to know, like months after that, because if you started calling like a month before the election, they're not going to attend you. And you have to start studying your archives of the election to discover, because every country has its laws, and in our system, we do have a lot of disclosure of the candidates' documents because they have to present this to run. So we do have this every election, about, especially on their assets. They have to inform us what they have. And we actually check if they got something, if they lost something. And you have to start to preparing these, even from the ones that you do know. For example, Lula is president for the 3rd time now, but he actually is running for the presidency since the 90s. So we do have like lots of information about him in our electoral system. So there is a very nice research to do it inside of that. And one basic mistake people usually make is that, oh, I do already know everything about, so I'm not going to look on the background anymore. And usually people change during the time, and people who is around the candidate change. There are enemies, opponents, people fight during this period, and usually those are the best sources. Yeah. People who fought with each other usually give you lots of insights, and even sometimes people who are still together, close, but who actually are trying to get better position and are not very happy enough where they are. They also give you good information, the friendly fire we were talking about before.
Okay, I want to ask the same question but differently, now focused on platforms, right? So because the platforms aren't specifically the people who are going to be managing an election, but they'll manage the perceptions that people have of an election. How much of your time do you dedicate to looking at the different ways in which platforms are changing their policies, the community guidelines, and what's happening on that front that you think should be a warning to all of us who are looking at investigating elections?
Honestly, more time than I'd like to. But I think one of the things, I feel like right now we're in a really weird time because after 2016, the platforms put together a lot of policies to, increase transparency, and a lot of that was to do with the scrutiny they were under. And what's happened since, especially in the last six to 9 months, is that a lot of those measures have gone away. So Facebook's dismantled their trust and safety team. Twitter is, I don't have words to describe what Twitter is right now versus what it used to be.
Well, Twitter's been next,
Twitter's been next,
put it
exactly.
rather blandly, yes. Yeah.
And Twitter took away its API, where prior to that moment, it was probably the most studied platform because of how easy it was to access Twitter data. And they've also kind of done things where you need to be logged in to view a profile. Facebook's anti-scraping teams and efforts are wild. And so when you kind of piece all of that together, it's like, okay, how, what you guys have both said is we have to continuously in real time monitor social media, but what happens when our transparency tools get taken away, and how do we keep getting more and more creative? And I think that's what I spend a lot of time on.
If and this is an unfair question, but if you had $1 billion, what kind of tools would you create to ensure that transparency sort of stays the front banner?
I mean, if I had $1 billion, I'd go to an island somewhere. But I think with everything, I think there are a lot newer platforms right now as well. There's TikTok, there's YouTube. I mean, YouTube isn't new. And I think a couple of things that I would like to do is, one, have the same interface that everyone uses. Because right now what we're doing is we're building custom tools for different platforms. And that's just not scalable because, you blink and a new platform comes up these days. So it's like, okay, so that's the first thing, right? How do we get data in a standardized format? The second thing is, how do we try to monitor the darker communication channels? And what I mean by that is, you would know Brazil and WhatsApp, Telegram in Russia. There's so much happening on these, darker channels or private channels, which, we just don't really talk about when it comes to the UK or the US. But I feel like even in the US right now, more communications are moving towards WhatsApp. So it's right, how do we... And also with those channels, we have to think about how do we do it in a privacy-preserving way, because there is a reasonable expectation of privacy for anybody who's on WhatsApp. And then the other thing with all of that is then, how do you ensure that all of these tools don't get in the wrong hands and do the kind of things to, mess with democracy or the voting public? And it's kind of people far, 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 far smarter than me to get in the room and try and figure that out.
Okay. Carol, by the way, I don't think that you shouldn't be in that room. You should be leading that room, given the kind of work that you're doing every day. Carol, I want to ask a final question before we turn to the audience. Similar to what I was asking in terms of looking forward, right? So you are one of the people who really helped, the public understand what exactly is going on. If you are, what kind of things are you going to be dedicating your time to if you're looking at elections over the next couple of years? What are the areas that you're going to be investing the most of your energy in? And what kind of advice would you give to anyone in the audience who's thinking about covering elections? Of course, it varies, context to context.
Well, I think partly it's, I don't know how many editors are here, how many here are coming as journalists, but I think it's partly having this conversation in newsrooms about actually you need a kind of war plan for this, I think, now, and understanding of that you are the front line between kind of democracy and authoritarianism, and that is really, I think, that's this is critical, and understanding that, this interface, which is rapidly changing in the way that Pri is talking about, and the same tools that you might have relied on in the last election aren't necessarily going to work, and sort of really I think, underlining the importance of that. I think, as I sort of said, it's almost like we need an active imagination of thinking about the ways of, like, what is the worst case scenario. You know, we had a lot of alarmism about deepfake videos ahead of a critical election, and actually that didn't come about in the ways that we thought it might. But now it might, because the cost of those tools and the availability of them have really gone down. So being able to respond to things in real time. And I had a really critical point I wanted to say, but I've forgotten what it is now.
Hopefully you remember as a question. So, Juliana, I want to ask the same. Are you done with?
No, it's all right. Yeah, hand it to somebody else.
All right. So, Juliana, same question to you. You know, you've covered a critical election in Brazil, and you've developed a method of being able to work. Focusing on the individual, looking into the background, asking the basic questions, and also then now following the trail. I want to add something of a thought to you in terms of collaboration. How important was it to collaborate either with other media houses or other people who have expertise in areas that you felt perhaps not as strong as in covering elections? This might be people, like researchers like Pri, or people who've covered certain aspects of electoral malpractice before. How important is it, going forward?
We had a very difficult time trying to make collaboration during the election because it's also very competitive. People are all running against each other. But we had a very important experience in Brazil about the debates. During the pandemic, we had a problem with Bolsonaro's government. They tried to hide the numbers of people who were dying of COVID. So the press reunited to collect the data from the sources, the original sources, and not from the Ministry of Health. That, during the election, made one alliance to form groups of media to organize debates, because I know this is common on the US, but in Brazil, no. Usually, every media outlet organized its own debate on the candidates. And one thing that was going to happen is that Bolsonaro said that he was not going to any of them because the media were all against him. So when the groups organized themselves to do it together, that sort of put him against the wall. And no, we're together now. It's not just one, so you have to come. And he actually made to a few organized this way. This was one important thing. But we had moments when we were facing this court order to censor our story. Our colleagues from all different media outlets covered the censorship, and that made a very huge pressure on the Supreme Court to rule fast to release the story again. And I know that if the other media outlets did not cover that, we probably would be censored until today. But that was one important moment. I think we have to discuss more collaboration and find ways to collaborate during the election. But this is a matter. This is something to discuss still.
All right. On that note, I'd like to collaborate with you.